Episode 77, May the 9th, 1915. A gunner at Festubert. When we were short of shells. By Major Franklin Lushington, otherwise known as Mark 7. Read by Steve Bristow. On May the 9th, my brigade took part in the battle at Festubert. The night before, Allington and Shadbolt, fellow subalterns, slept lightly and uneasily in a farm cart. About an hour before dawn, they rose in the darkness and crept shivering onto their guns. Except for an occasional rifle shot, the front was deathly quiet, and one could plainly hear men stumbling about and shouting in the neighbouring fields, as by the fitful lantern light they prepared their monstrous gods for the coming day. Suddenly there was a deafening crack, followed by 4 stabbing flashes of flame. The 18-pounder battery behind had opened fire. As if this were the signal, every battery on the front crashed into a thunderous accompaniment, and the whole earth seemed to shake to the blasting roar of their guns. Shadbolt's first battle had begun. In the half-light behind the gun, he watched the mechanical feeding of an insatiable monster by its statuesque slaves, their grey, unshaven faces contorted by the flickering gunfire into something evil and unearthly. This diabolic illusion was increased by their continual ramming and stoking, their tireless activity, and their silence. Across the orchard, the men on Allington's gun were working with the same precise and deadly concentration. Through the trees he could see his friend's long legs moving restlessly to and fro as he checked the sights and ammunition and superintended the working of his detachment. The whole of that bright May day, this devil's work went on, and in the evening its first results appeared in the shape of a few shaken-looking prisoners in muddy field grey, who crept in listless batches down the road behind the battery positions. The gunners crowded round them demanding souvenir, the only word common to all the nations at war. Each man returned with a helmet, the old German Pickelhaube, a set of buttons, a belt, or a haversack. One wondered if those poor prisoners would retain even their clothes by the time they arrived in rear. The next day Shadbolt was sent forward to observe from a captured German trench. Taking with him his batman, gunner Langmead, and 2 signallers, he threaded his way through a maze of battered trenches. Sandbags and dead bodies lay jumbled there in wild confusion, as if some petulant giant growing tired of play had thrown down his broken toys in heaps. Finally, they arrived in a little trench so choked with dead and so void of all semblance of a parapet that it had been left unoccupied by our troops. Sandbagging up one corner of this, Shadbolt and the signallers settled down to the day's work, whilst the cherubic-faced batman set off on the inevitable souvenir hunt. He had just left when the enemy began a tremendous bombardment, the exact centre of which seemed to be situated on their isolated and defenceless little post. Shells were bursting with thundering concussions in front and in rear, to the right and to the left, and in the air above, when the major rang up from the battery to inquire what was happening and whether a counter-attack was impending. These were points which Shadbolt would gladly have been clear about himself, as he knew that between him and the enemy, a few hundred yards away, there was only one tired company of Coldstream Guards in a hastily thrown-up trench. "You must go and find the infantry OC, ask what's happening and what we can do to help." This meant 150 yards mostly over the open. At school, Shadbolt had won a cup for the quarter-mile, but he beat his own record that day. Arriving panting and splashed with mud, he was informed by a bored sentry that the officers were having lunch about 2 bays down the trench, and as he rounded the next traverse, he caught the words, "Fruit salad, my lord." Apparently quite unmoved by the activities of the enemy, They asked him to lunch and suggested that, when things had quietened down, he should shoot up a machine gun which was worrying them. Declining the friendly invitation, he only stayed to locate the offending machine gun and then bolted back to reassure the major. A quarter of an hour later, when the bombardment had died down to scattered shelling, in staggered Master Langmead, absolutely covered with pickelhaubers, sword bayonets, and other trophies of war. "Please, sir, I'm sorry I've been away so long, but I brought you this ring, which I got off a dead officer's finger." Early in June, the battery moved to Anakam, where a whole month was spent without firing a round. Every effort had been made by those at home to supply the much-needed ammunition for Neuve-Chapelle and Festubert. At the last-named battle, some of the 6-inch shells were stenciled April 24th, showing that no time was wasted between the factory and the gun. Actually, since the beginning of the war, about 49,000 rounds had been shipped to France by this date. This compares with 38,000 a month for the first 6 months of 1916, 290,000 a month during the Battle of the Somme, 840,000 a month throughout 1917, and over 1 million a month in 1918. The effect of these early battles was to shoot away all the available supply, and for some months after Festubert, all siege batteries were reduced to a maximum of 12 rounds a day. At that time, the only ammunition supplied to these batteries was some 6-inch gun shell from Gibraltar, which had been condemned as unserviceable in the piping times of peace. To ensure safety, these were fired by means of a specially long lanyard, all the gun's crew being ordered out of the gun pit except the hero who pulled the string. A premature occurred in a neighbouring battery, which blew the whole of the front of the barrel off, but owing to the care that was taken when firing these condemned shells, no casualties occurred. Whether they caused any casualties amongst the enemy is also an open question. A few 6-inch shrapnel were also issued, but it was found quite impossible to persuade them to burst at the right spot in the path of their trajectory. This is, of course, just before they reach the ground, so that the shrapnel bullets spray out like the drops from a watering can. Fired from the howitzers, they usually burst about a quarter of a mile up in the air, or on the ground, or quite frequently not at all. Time hung very heavily for officers and men alike. Books and newspapers were in great demand, and the arrival of the mail from home was the outstanding event of the day. The captains sketched, the subalterns loafed and read, and the gunners played house all day. This is a gambling card game much beloved by the troops, and consists in betting on the face value of the cards dealt out to each player. Part of a second pack is then dealt, the dealer in a sing-song voice calling out the values, most of which have special names. On a hot afternoon, half asleep under a gun tarpaulin, Shadbolt and Allington listened to the droning, unceasing chant, clickety-click, number 7, Kelly's Eye, legs 11, number 9, top of the house, while in the distance a regular whine and bang indicated that the enemy gunners were getting rid of their daily allotment. Nearby, a battery of French 75s, like irritated terriers, would occasionally reply with a spurt of angry yapping, but elsewhere, from the British positions, all was quiet. Shadbolt visited the French battery once or twice and was much impressed by their methods. He never found more than 4 men in the battery position, 1 to each gun, though there must have been others hidden away somewhere. On his first visit, he was accosted by a friendly-looking tramp in odds and ends of soiled uniform, who appeared to be the only inhabitant. This individual turned out to be a sergeant, and finding that the visitor understood French and was also a gunner, was only too delighted to show him round and to describe the inner workings. After an exhaustive inspection of the whole battery, he inquired whether Monsieur le Capitaine would like to fire a round at the sale Boche. Shadbolt said he would. Without further ceremony, the Frenchman pushed around into the ball and told him to shoot. Thereupon, he banged into the blue, shook hands with his gallant ally, and departed, still without seeing another soul. Shadbolt could not help contrasting this with the methods employed in his own battery, where the procedure of firing involved a solemn ritual including an officer and 6 acolytes per gun, and attendant high priests standing round with range tables and telephones. The OP for the Anakim position was situated in the wing of a large distillery in the support line. At various times, this had been occupied as an OP by every battery in the British Army, as well as by the French and Germans in 1914. In the vast cellar lived the signallers and telephone exchanges of no less than 5 batteries. They had made themselves comfortable, with lanterns and stoves, broken armchairs, old French beds, and a piano. The first night that Shadbolt arrived, the Germans were putting up their usual evening hate on the village behind. The noise of bursting enemy shells was loud and continuous, but the only retaliation from the British lines was, "Hold your hand out, you naughty boy," played to an accompaniment of much laughter and shouting on the cellar piano. He decided to sleep upstairs, where the advantages of a large double bed and plenty of fresh air seemed to outweigh the possible disadvantages of a wandering whiz-bang or a spent rifle bullet. One wall of his bedroom had been blown away, and he looked straight down a long vista of ruined rooms, on which the flare lights from the trenches cast flickering, fantastic shadows. The ghosts of all the nations who had fought and died in this place crept and peered and prowled. Every so often a brick would fall, or a bomb go off, and they would stop and listen. Shadbolt was connected by a speaking tube to the cellar, but it seemed hardly in keeping with his dignity as an officer to order gunner Langmead to keep him company. Another OP was in a ruined house in Quanchy, just off the La Bassée road. One sultry Sunday afternoon, when all else was quiet on the Western Front, the enemy began methodically to shell the building with 5.9s. Shadbolt and a subaltern from another battery, who were both on duty, thought it best to retire to a small sandbag dugout at the back. They stood at the entrance to the dugout, which was splinter-proof and no more, and watched the performance with professional interest. In the stillness, one could hear the German howitzer fire, followed by the long-drawn whine of the approaching shell, and the shattering burst as it landed on a house or a garden wall. They counted the overs and shorts, and the rights and lefts, and were presently joined by Saunders from Shadbolt's battery, who had come up to repair the cut telephone wire. Suddenly, one shell seemed to be coming much closer, and Shadbolt felt a sharp pain in his leg as he dived with the others for the mouth of the dugout. The blast of the explosion knocked him flat, and when he staggered to his feet, he found both the others covered with mud and blood, moaning on the ground. Binding them up as well as he could, he then discovered that a small splinter had severed a muscle in his thigh, that the telephone wires were again cut, and that the enemy had gone to gunfire, that is, having found the range slowly and methodically with one gun, he was now firing the whole battery as hard and as fast as he could. It seemed as if the rocking dugout would certainly collapse on them, with the mere force of the explosions. Saunders was unconscious, but the other subaltern, who was badly hit, kept crying for help in a piteous way. There was nothing to be done but wait. After what seemed to be an eternity, but was in reality not more than 10 or 15 minutes, a figure appeared at the doorway, and a quiet voice said, "Are any of you fellows alive?" It was the colonel. It appeared that a hysterical signaller had run the whole way down to the battery and reported that 3 officers had been killed and the OP destroyed. Whereupon the colonel, who happened to be in the position, had calmly walked up through the shelling to see for himself, while an ambulance was sent for by telephone.
To death I go.